shouting out. You probably know that that's often associated with Zen teachers, especially in Japan. You know, they yell, shout, use a stick, all this stuff. What's that about? It's an expression of something, expression of what? The life force, enlightenment. And you see it, you know, other places too, obviously. If you've been following the US Open, then you know how the players, Serena's probably playing as we speak. You know, they hit their volleys or their serves and they shout. Ooh, ooh, ooh. It's an expression, I guess, of exertion or what. So there's something vital going on, but especially in Zen, there's, as I say, it's an expression of power, of encouragement, of enlightenment, the whole life force, the whole life, an intensity of presence is there. If it's the master who's doing it. There are often examples cited, and I've seen videos of this, where the student goes into Daisan, you know, to see how enlightened he is, or she is, and he goes, boo! And of course, they think that means they're enlightened because they can shout. So of course, the teacher says, get out of here, and sends them back. You know. You remember, it's a little bit like that. The koan we saw recently, where Gute holds up his finger, and this was his response to anyone who asked what Buddha is, what Buddhism is. He just held up a finger, and for him, just like everything is concentrated in the shout, all of reality is concentrated in the shout. All of reality is right here in the finger. But remember, his attendant tried to answer people's questions with the same thing. When he held up his finger, it didn't mean at all the same thing. Because he wasn't awake to the fact that all reality was right there. He was just imitating somebody, like the person who goes and screams or shouts. There's actually a very well-known koan about that thing, how the same apparent action can have two totally different meanings according to the one who's doing it, according to the amount of awareness that goes into it. One of the early koans in the Mamonkan, number 11, Joshu, that great master, it's called Joshu Sees the Hermits. So Joshu went to a hermit's cottage and asked, is the master in? Which is already a trick question. Who's the master? He's not referring to himself. Is the master in? Is the master in? And the hermit raised his fist. You know, it's like a shout, you know, a silent shout. And Joshu said, the water's too shallow to anchor here. And he went away. He came to another hermit's cottage. He asked again, is the master in? Is the master in? And this hermit too raised his fist. And Joshu said, free to give, free to take, free to kill, free to save. In other words, complete freedom, complete awareness. And he made a deep bow. Now, in the external action, there was no difference at all. But there was, in terms of awareness, consciousness, that he picked that up. And that's what can often happen. But let's get back to this notion of the shout, you know, what it can signify. Reflecting on that. It can be an expression, as in the masters, of the whole energy of reality is present, you know, like whether raising the fist, but in this case, we're raising the finger even, and just shouting, just roaring. And there's a great koan in the Blue Cliff record, number 85, which is exactly this. A monk came to visit the master of Toho Hermitage and said to him, if on this mountain you were suddenly to meet a tiger, what would you do? And the master roared like a tiger. And the monk pretended to be frightened. And the master roared with laughter. I wonder if it's the same word in Japanese. But it's interesting, there's the same word in English. The master roared like a tiger, and he roared with laughter. And in both cases, he was entirely present and entirely expressed himself. And then the monk, well, that was the exchange. It goes on for a few more phrases, but that's the essence of it. So, the roar can be about the whole being. The whole of reality is present. And notice the tiger, the lion, these Manjushri's lion, for example, the great Bodhisattva's expression of these animal energies which are part of reality, which are part of us, the Kundalini and everything else. The totem in Native Americans is the same idea, that all of this is marshaled and transformed and brought to bear, in that roar. The whole of reality, whether you want to call it heavenly or earthly, all of reality is and should be expressed in that. It can be expressed by this roar, the shout, of reality, in a person. But I'd like to explore that a little bit, looking also at the Judeo-Christian tradition here. You speak about the voice of God coming like thunder. One of the Psalms, for example, Psalm 29, is all about that. You can go back and look at it. It says, the voice of God, the voice of God, the voice of God, and it's basically talking about a thunderstorm. So, the voice of God can be like thunder. Although, remember the story of Elijah, who went to the mouth of the cave in the Book of Kings, was running away from Queen Jezebel and King Ahab, and he heard the rocks and an earthquake and a fire and everything, and then he heard a small whisper. God was in the whisper. But in Zen terms, in mystical terms, the whisper is a shout. The whisper has all the intensity of a shout, all the more so for being silent. And the greatest shout, the greatest voice of God is silence. The silent shout. Because all of reality is right there. Whether it's expressed vocally or not. But it can be a shout. So the voice of God in the thunderstorm, the voice of God like thunder. Remember when Jesus, just before he died, John chapter 12, the voice of God came down from heaven, and the people said, according to the text, an angel has spoken to him. So an angel is like thunder, is like a shout of God, voice of God. And another, they also said, oh no, it's thunder. So thunder, voice of God, angel, shout, all those things are together there. And one of the voices of God phrases in that Psalm 29 says, the voice of God shaking the desert. And that's interesting because one of the bells, the big bells in the monastery, the Grand Chartreuse, my monastery in France, had written on it that phrase. The voice of God shaking up the desert. And of course the desert was the monastery, the wilderness of the desert and the monastery. So God's voice shakes up our inner desert, our inner wilderness, and the bell is an indication of that. So when you hear the gong, that's a shout of reality, and it's a way of bringing us deeper and deeper down. As you hear it fade away, you go deeper and deeper down into yourself to the root of reality there. So the gong we always use is the voice of God shaking up the desert and waking us up. And all bells, the great bells, the pealing bells of Christian churches and all or the bells of Zen monasteries, the great gongs of Tibetan monasteries, it's all the same thing. All of reality is concentrated there, and it leads us to that very awareness, and to that very waking up, so we can ourselves be that voice of God in everything we do and say. With that voice of reality, the voice of the Buddha. So the imagery is very interesting. Another way that comes across, that shout, it's in Psalm 150 that we have today actually in the liturgy, that shout of joy, or the shout of the voice of the shofar, there's the trumpet, the ram's horn in Jewish lore, which appears in that psalm. You know what a huge sound that is if you've ever heard it. That ram's horn that's blown even today in synagogues coming up for the high holidays. It's that really deep, visceral, almost scary voice of reality which comes from way down in the depths, including those animal energies. And the word that's used for that blowing of the shofar is a word which can also mean the thrust of a sword or clapping in hands. It's that powerful and that penetrating and that sudden. Just as reality is powerful, penetrating, and sudden when you really wake up to it. Voice of the trumpet, which in this case is the ram's horn. But the trumpet comes up again in Exodus when they go up Mount Sinai. You hear the vast trumpet blowing, the trumpet of God. Or to bring the angel and the trumpet back together again in the book of the letter to the Thessalonians, where it says, when we rise from the dead, at the sound of the angel's voice and of the last trumpet blast, or the trumpet blasts of the book of Revelation, that's what's being expressed. The very power and depth of reality we call God is coming into and down into and marshalling and expressing itself through ourselves, through humans, through angels. It's a trumpet blast which we hear, and a trumpet blast which we become. That shout, which we are. And I want to finish by talking about two specific instances of this. The shout of dying. Some people groan or shout, and Jesus did. I went back over the Gospels and checked that out. Whether he says, "Into your hands I commend my spirit," or "Why have you abandoned me?" He shouts with a great voice. It says he cried out, and he shouted, and raised his voice in a big, great voice. It says in a couple of the Gospels. What does that express? Doubt, fear, resignation, or just the whole of reality in himself, giving itself, primal and profound. Anyway, that's what happened to the Zen masters. They did the same thing. The story is told of Ryutan. We saw a couple of weeks ago the one who blew out the candle for Tokusan, and Tokusan was enlightened when he blew out the candle in the dark. So Ryutan knew about the darkness. But it was said that as he was dying, he was agonizing and crying out. And his disciples said, No, you're scandalizing people. Don't cry out. You know what he said? My agonized crying out is the same as my joyful singing. It's just the appropriate expression of reality in this moment. All of it is there. And it's singing, or shouting, or a trumpet blast, or whatever. That's amazing. Another person did that similarly. Listen to this story. I was very struck by this. Ganto was a hermit. He became the master of a large temple, but he was finally killed by looters who plundered his temple. And finding Ganto alone doing zazen, of course, as you would expect. People are looting his palace, but he's just doing zazen. What else are you going to do? All the other monks having fled, they murdered him. And as he was killed, he gave a great shout, which is said to have resounded for 10 Chinese leagues. Whoa! This shout, it says, proved a great problem to monks in later years. You know, like they were scandalized like Ryutan, including Hakuin, the most famous master of the last 300 years in the 18th century, who could not understand its meaning. But listen to this. The problem was solved for Hakuin at the moment of his enlightenment. And he cried out, "Oh, Ganto is still alive, strong and healthy." Because that's what it meant. It was just, the whole of reality was right there, and the whole of reality is deathless. The shout resounded beyond, and is forever. One of Dogen's famous phrases is, "Life and death are just the Buddha life." We would say the same as Christians. Life and death are just the Christ life. So if you're shouting when you're dying, it's an expression of being totally alive. Ganto is alive and healthy. Christ is alive and healthy. We're alive and healthy, even as we die. It's just the appropriate response to the moment right here and now. All of reality is there, and all of reality is deathless. So what does your shout mean? How present are you? What is really there? And one final point. Shouting out in wrathful compassion. There's a difference between that and anger. As John McCransky said very well, the Lama John McCransky in a recent article, comparing wrath, anger, human anger, with its irritation and its egocentric source and end, to wrathful compassion. You like the wrathful deities in Tibetan Buddhism, when you see these shouting and really fearful beings. It's just an expression of reality, of the compassion of waking people up, shouting to wake them up. There's no enmity or hatred or irritation towards people. It's simply an expression of reality, compassion and reality, wrathful compassion. Wrathful compassion. Don't presume you're being wrathfully compassionate when you're telling somebody off. But be aware that really wrathful compassion, this powerful compassion, is a real expression of compassion, and not just the sweet kind. There can be a wrathful kind, a powerful kind. There's completely egoless, like reality itself. Maybe Jesus in the temple, casting out the money changers is a good example. There was no anger or irritation there. It was simply wrathful. So, don't be afraid of the shout, no matter how silent or how loud it is, provided it's real, provided it's reality itself. Don't be scandalized by it, and don't be afraid of it in yourself or others. Okay? Good. Any questions or comments?